Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording today's Indications and Warnings on April 22nd, 2025. It is day 1,154 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion. Chuck and I have been AWOL. We both admit it, but we're back.
We have been in different places around the world. Glad to know, which is no excuse for not connecting, but the schedules have been pretty strenuous, and Alan and I are very, very, very happy to get back together here. So we're having at it. Thank you for waiting, folks.
And we're going to start off with an easy note, a weather report from Ukraine. Pay attention because it's in the high 70s in Kyiv and Kharkiv and Sumy with light winds, bright sunshine. These are spectacular springtime days in Ukraine. In Odessa, on the sea, highs in the upper 60s. There's no substantial rain in the forecast over the next 7 to 10 days. Well, why begin with a weather report? Because offensives depend on weather, especially in the spring and fall when heavy rains can interrupt logistics and mobility. And Russia is pledging to launch a spring offensive campaign, but the question is where?
Right. And there are several attack vectors that suggest themselves. One, of course, would be a direct Russian attack on Sumy. There would be another place to suggest itself, which would be in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. And that assessment as a likely attack vector comes more from Russian psychology than anything else. They have wanted Pokrovsk for quite a long time. They have expended tens of thousands of casualties in that direction, possibly 100,000 casualties. They've not achieved that objective. Zaporizhzhia suggests itself, and a dark horse candidate is Kherson. And Alan and I were talking backstage, and the Russians have pledged a spring offensive, haven't they, Alan?
Yes, they have. And I was actually surprised to see an increase in assaults around Pokrovsk. I happen to think in looking at the map, and we are going to look at the Pokrovsk map later on in the show. I don't think they are offensive in nature. They are not aimed at the city of Pokrovsk, where Ukraine has been very successful in pushing Russia back. Rather, they are all along the western edge of battle. It looks pretty defensive to me.
Yeah, we're going to get in. Alan has come up with 7 factors that are going to relate to a possible Russian offensive. But of course, Ukraine's reaction to this impending possibility of offensive action, it's going to depend on what military resources are available to the Ukrainians, and by that I mean beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. Right? Where are they going to get them? How are they going to get them to the point of attack? And all of those things are doable. And people who've been listening to us for a long time know that you want to anticipate your opponent's operations, and intelligence is the key to that. Washington has demonstrated that it is not above materially harming Ukraine by switching off intelligence whenever it feels like it. Hanging over all military operations in Ukraine are these pending dialogues, negotiations, whatever they are with Russia. But I am happy to take a victory lap for Alan and I, who precisely predicted that the United States would be made a mug of by Putin, that he would not do anything he said he would do, that he would escalate his military actions during the during these negotiations, and that eventually Washington would become utterly frustrated and, at the very least, abandon the talks and turn over the table. But hopefully, Alan, they will do one more thing instead of just quit the negotiations, and I'll let you deliver the punchline.
They'll get mad and finally do the one thing that hasn't been done on behalf of Ukraine, and that is arming Ukraine for military victory over Russia. It's the only thing that has never been tried.
And Alan has been saying that, folks, for at least the last 8 months, and I think his quip goes all the way back to bullet points, which we did 3 years ago. So Alan has been right on this. Alan, you missed a career in the military. You would have been a fine officer and a great commander.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Maybe I still have time.
Don't do it, Alan. Don't do it. I'll talk you out of it. Don't do that now.
You know, I don't think Ukraine, I don't think anyone is shaking in their boots in anticipation of a Russian spring offensive. For one thing, Ukraine in this case has really had time on its side. We know that around Pokrovsk, digging in and improving fortifications really helped Ukraine to its successful defense of Pokrovsk. Well, they've had that opportunity all across the zero line. So Russia is going to face Ukrainian fortifications, expanded minefields, which if the weather doesn't slow Russia down, Ukraine's engineers will slow Russia down.
Right, and particularly in the Pokrovsk area of operations, this is where Ukraine learned I won't call it a bitter lesson, but a serious lesson after the fall of Avdiivka. I'm not willing to blame even the regional command here. There are ideas, there are military necessities, and they always come up against logistical realities, right? In hindsight, there's no question that the terrain west of Avdiivka should have been fortified in depth. Military positions that didn't necessarily have to be manned, but had to be created. And those opportunities weren't taken, and I do not think it was because people were asleep at the switch. I think it was a question of the availability of military engineers. And again, it's a military operational specialty. I've been in a couple of wars, but you don't want me, a naval officer, designing your defense in depth. You need military engineers. They need heavy equipment. These are troops that they are combat capable troops, so you have to pull them away from somewhere else. They build and they fight. So a missed opportunity. I don't think that the Russians will find that the positions to the west of their lines now, they're not going to find. Those are going to be a walkover.
Yeah.
And as Alan said, these are positions that have been prepared, and they're going to pay the toll if they try to pass.
Yeah. Maybe a spring offensive for the Russians will become a make or break moment for Russia. I don't know. They at one time controlled 30% of Ukraine. They now occupy less than 20% of Ukraine. This spring offensive could be the military's plea with Putin, give us one more chance. And I bet it's a chance they shouldn't be taking.
Well, there is there's always the possibility. Ukraine has been on the sort of strategic and tactical defensive for the last 24 months in this war. That doesn't mean they're on the back foot at all. You can still win a war fighting it defensively. And there are some indicators that the Russians should be paying attention to, but they're not. And to our Russian listening guests, get out the pen, write this down, and then weep when it happens to you. There were battles just before the Easter truce, where there was a day where the Russian losses in terms of personnel were about 1,200. That's a lot of people. That itself is a battalion of men. They lose that routinely. But what struck me, they lost a number of tanks sufficient and a number of artillery pieces and armored vehicles sufficient to an entire battalion of armor, 8 battalions of artillery, and 130 armored fighting vehicles in one day's combat.
Yeah.
That was essentially more than a brigade task group wiped out. Now, it was done in 2 or 3 heavy contacts, but a dozen or so other contacts. So why am I going on about this? Well, when Russia tries to move larger size formations, they have a long and growing history of getting their asses kicked. At south of Kupiansk, where they lost a battalion in 20 minutes. The battles of Vuhledar 1 and 2, where they got absolutely plastered. Some of their better formations, a naval infantry brigade, the 115th. When a country's Marines are always better trained, they just got smoked. So, an impending spring offensive from Russia, does that mean larger formations? Does it mean larger forces at the point of contact? But I'll tell you what it will mean, Russian listening guests. Your preparations for these attacks, if they are coming, will be absolutely pinpointed by NATO intelligence. That will be shared with the Ukrainians. And here's my War College training aid. The Russian forces look like this, right? They are taking a bite out of Ukraine, but that means the Ukrainians are here. Now, this looks like you're going to get eaten, but in military terms, this means I can hit you anywhere. You have to go all the way around here to hit me. So you don't always need material or even manpower superiority to defeat your adversary. You need to be superior at the point of attack, right? Rogers Rangers, another great New Englander, you get there firstest with the mostest.
That was the Green Mountain Boys, right?
The Green Mountain Boys, absolutely. From Vermont to our international listeners, and which
Right.
is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful state.
It sure is. Speaking of intelligence in the air, a couple of things caught my attention. Today, Japan pledged to share satellite imagery with Ukraine. That's important if the United States were ever again to withhold that imagery from Ukraine. Japan would be there to plug that gap. And yesterday and today, a plane, whether it was an AWACS or some other surveillance plane that the Ukrainians have available, was in the air east of Lviv. Lviv is in the extreme west of Ukraine. But these surveillance planes, like an AWACS, they can look 450, 500 kilometers in any direction. So this is a Ukrainian aircraft that's up in the air, I believe, Chuck.
Yes, I posted on this yesterday, and if I repost something, or generally, I try to get as many points of triangulation as I can. And one of our distinguished colleagues, Axel Jacobs, heard from a Swedish parliamentarian who didn't agree with me that this was, in fact, a Swedish ASC 890, which is a turboprop 2-engine AWACS platform, but it has a rectilinear radar, so it doesn't have the flying saucer on top. I had Axel thank him for his concerns about the post, etc. But I would say this: the flight paths of that aircraft, which were long and U-turns, those are indicative of an aircraft with precisely that rectilinear radar arrangements. If you had an E-2 Hawkeye, it can fly wherever it wants. It has a circular sensor envelope. I can't say categorically that that was a Swedish manufactured aircraft. The flight pattern makes me think it was. And I can understand Swedish sensibilities, but I think the Russians know what sort of electronic emissions were occurring during this sortie. And I think we'll just have to guess that it probably was a test flight. And this is going to be a quantum leap forward in the effectiveness of Ukrainian air operations. And and especially because the Russian AWACS platforms, they only have 6 of them, and of that, maybe 2 are flight worthy. And some of these models are incapable of in-flight refueling. So they get an AWACS plane up every whatever it is, couple of days.
Or maybe it's a matter of weeks that go by.
It has been, and they don't have flight crews. They've lost 2 aircraft in combat, fully loaded with their flight crews. So, and again, that whole program wasn't big enough. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the U.S. Air Force that are qualified to sit in those certain seats to man conduct the air battle mission. And I'm not sure the Russians have that. Again, these are the kind of force multiplication bits of equipment that Ukraine requires. And I'll just conclude this by always saying this. If the U.S. Army were fighting in Ukraine under its material constraints that it has right now, they'd be getting their butts kicked, right? No air superiority, no electronic warfare, no battle management, no artillery, everything that we speak of.
Well, that in a way it leads me to these 7 categories that I was trying to consider. Who has the superiority in these 7 categories? And you can't talk about superiority along all almost 1,000 kilometers of the zero line. There can be localized superiority, just as Ukraine has achieved around Pokrovsk with drones in particular. But the 7 categories that I was thinking about, Chuck, and there may be some that you want to add, or there may be one that you say, yeah, it's not that important. But I'm thinking about drones. And yes, when you think about drones, you have to think about the flip side of the coin as well, electronic warfare. So that's category 1, drones, electronic warfare. Air power, armor, artillery, infantry, intel, reconnaissance, intel, and logistics. Uh, you know, Russia has had air superiority from the beginning of this war, and they're going to have it until the end of this war. I don't think there's any question about that. But look at drones and electronic warfare. Who really has a superiority in that category? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Ukraine is ahead. They are in fact a world leader. We've seen the cat and mouse game of electronic warfare, but I always like to predicate these discussions and put it this way. If you're going to get killed on a battlefield in Ukraine, you're a Russian, chances are it's a first-person drone that's going to kill you. 3 years ago, there were not first-person drones hunting infantrymen on battlefields. 3 years ago, the Javelin missile was the thing that was going to decide the life and death of enemy armor. Javelins cost $250,000 just for the missile, not the launcher and the training, etc. First-person drone costs what, $1,000 and $35 for an RPG warhead. There has been an absolute back and forth with electronic warfare. It's a battle that we see every day. We don't really get an impression from media that is surveyable, but I have it on extraordinarily good authority. I actually know what I'm talking about. And some of this stuff that Ukrainian electronic warfare is superior. Its ability to penetrate Russian electronic warfare precautions, broadcasts, etc., is superior. And Ukraine is on the verge, and in fact it's not something that's going to click on and off like a light bulb. It's getting this way, that its own mechanisms of control of their drones and multiple drones in multiple engagements is undergoing a quantum change that the Russians will not be able to catch up to. And one of the things we will see eventually, we haven't seen one in this war yet. We have seen multi-vector drone attacks. In fact, every drone attack is multi-vectored. Even those that occur over thousands of kilometers, and targets have been hit up to 2,000 kilometers inside Russia. But we are going to see swarming drone attacks, meaning you are going to release a cloud of drones whose algorithms will allow them to prosecute targets on the battlefield without a human operator. That's coming. It'll happen this year. Within the next, between now and next spring, we'll see that.
It is frightening. I'm sure we will see it. I don't know if viewers and listeners saw this news item. In the skies above Shanghai, China, 1,500 drones assembled to create a readable QR code in the sky over Shanghai. I don't know what they were selling, but something on Alibaba, right? But that exercise alone tells you, in a very frightening way, what could be coming on battlefields of the future, starting in Ukraine.
Yeah, whenever I see one of those, a giant dragon in the sky or Mickey Mouse or whatever it is, look, that's not advertising your favorite foot cream. That is a national demonstration of power.
Yeah.
That is telling you that whatever target you have, we can make every one of these things come in a cloud that you can't fight.
Yeah.
So we will see that. And there's another thing I always like to remind people. There are two armies in the world that are the most experienced in 21st century warfare, and none of them are in NATO, and none of them are the United States. And that is Ukraine and Russia. Everything has changed now. This is a bigger change than cavalry attacks in World War I going up against the machine gun. It is way beyond that. And the Ukrainian army is the best at it, period.
Chuck, you took that thought right out of my head. There are only two armies in the world who have experience in 21st century warfare, and that means experience with drones. Now, Russia is training North Korean and Chinese troops in using drones and in using tactics on a drone-saturated battlefield. The Danes are sending a few, and they stressed, unarmed Danish soldiers to Ukraine for training purposes, the purpose being to find out how to use drones, how to integrate drone tactics into infantry tactics, and to have the experience of encountering drones on the battlefield. Those are the very first NATO soldiers that will get this experience in Ukraine, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, and there's another. Why do Alan and I always say this is a quantum leap and first 21st century war and everything has changed? You can think of it this way. This is the democratization of a couple of major military functions that only used to exist, and I mean 3 years ago, at the absolute highest echelons. Even as a tier one Navy SEAL, I could pick up the sat phone, I could get anything I wanted. B-52, Harrier, you name it, Apache, whatever I wanted. But I had to communicate with higher echelons for close air support. Now, I turn to a guy in my rifle squad and I go, let go your drones, and you've democratized air. So everybody has air support right next to them. Okay, here's another thing. Electronic warfare used to be the functions of carrier battle groups. I mean, if you had a nuclear reactor, you could deal in electronic warfare. Now there isn't a rifle squad, Russian or Ukrainian, that doesn't have one guy who's got an EW platform in his backpack. And these aren't the only revolutions in tactics, etc., but just that explained, I hope, so everybody can grasp it. That is a fundamental change. And that means things like you don't have a Navy, but you can sink a guided missile cruiser. The only Navy that's ever sunk a guided missile cruiser is the Ukrainian Navy. And folks, they ain't got a Navy.
Yeah. They don't have a Navy now, but they have control of the Black Sea.
Exactly. Stunning.
So I know we're going to circle back to drones and electronic warfare as we go through these other categories. But the second category that came to my mind, Chuck, was air power. And yes, the Russians have vast air superiority, and they use it in devastating ways every single day. I would have to say during the Trump ceasefire, which was not a ceasefire at all, or during the Putin Easter truce, which wasn't a truce at all either. Soviet air power was used primarily on civilian targets. Big glide bombs aimed against residential towers. We saw the destruction in Sumy on Palm Sunday, so more than a week ago now, and again, and glide bombs released today in Kharkiv and Kherson, also in Kyiv. Even Putin today, in remarking about these attacks, acknowledged that they occurred. Trump called them mistakes. Putin called them punishment. So he is acknowledging that his military has committed a war crime.
Yeah, and this is part of his psychological makeup. He has commented on numerous occasions, for example, retaliatory strikes against perceived Chechen terrorist threats he has described as punishment, as stern chastisement, although he doesn't know the word chastisement. He's kind of breathes through his mouth between words. But this is his take on it, and there's no question about it. You're punishing non-combatants again, but Alan, you and I have been pointing this out forever. If you've got a precision strike munition and you are a Russian commander, your priority targets are apartment buildings. Period. That's it. There are hundreds of thousands of examples we can look at. Let's just look at Mariupol, a utterly eviscerated city surrounded by tens of thousands of civilian burial sites, not to mention the mass graves, right? This is the Ruski Mir. This is the Ruski Mir.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever won a war by bombing playgrounds, but that's what Russia does. I will note that Ukraine has been more active in the air, more active with F-16s, with airstrikes against military targets in Kursk and Belgorod, especially military headquarters in both Kursk and Belgorod. But Ukraine will never, ever have air superiority in this war. It's an impossibility.
It is an impossibility, and building an air force and being able to project power from the air, it's a generational process, right? Russia and the United States were both aviation pioneers, right? And the development of an air force, look, it's only something that happened in the last sort of century, right? So the development of Air Force can be quick, but a century is, 4 generations of people, and a military generation is about 10 years. It's half as long, not for the least reason that, you're not going to be Alan or my age and flying around with Goose and Maverick, pulling 8 Gs in a, it's a young man's game. However, what Ukraine can do is continue their asymmetrical force postures, right? You don't have to be dominant everywhere. You don't need national air superiority, as desirable as it is. You need air superiority at the point of contact, right? Fight like the Viet Cong. They weren't strong everywhere, but where they fought, they brought force to bear. And the United States learned incredible lessons in Vietnam. A war we lost, and you win, you can win by learning from your adversary.
Yeah.
Asymmetrical fight. And, my entire career was in asymmetrical fights, right? I had 16 guys. I had to, so when you control every variable you can about the contact, and you plan things, including running away after you win the fight, you can do it for a long time.
Yeah. Moving on to armor, regardless of the thousands of tanks that Russia has lost, I'd still have to give the superiority advantage to Russia even today, because Ukraine has so few tanks, so few supplied by the United States, even by Germany and by Great Britain. 11 Abrams tanks sent to Ukraine's aid by the United States. I don't think they've seen more than a few days of battle.
Yeah, and there is, look, I first of all, I'm not an armor officer. I am, I would say, a reader of military tactics and history. The main battle tank is not dead, right? It is not going away. It is going to increase in its capabilities and its defensive armament, etc. But the Russians have lost tens of thousands of, they've lost staggering numbers of tanks. I did an article for the Kyiv Post a couple of months ago. Russia's losses in Ukraine amount to the total forces available to NATO, not just NATO ground forces. They've lost the equivalent of every single person in every single military in all of NATO. I mean, you let that sink in. That's not winning, right? And we are talking about the possibility of a Russian spring offensive, and Alan has delineated the factors that we're talking about. But look, Russia's never going to win this war. No. Not with losses like these. One thing that Russia does better than anyone in the world is their gray zone operations, and their information warfare is without peer anywhere. They can murder somebody on a Moscow street and convince you that that journalist was an absolute threat to the nation of whatever, and that it didn't happen, right? That the Crimean people really wanted Russia. They can make you believe anything. The other thing at which they excel is the ability of the Russian people to suffer and endure. And they are never going to run out of Vatniks. However, those Vatniks, civilians, are not going to win the war.
No.
We've seen time and time again, their soldiering skills are ridiculous, laughable, and frankly, offend me as a military officer that you would put people like that into combat.
Well, one thing I will say in the armor category, you see Ukraine use its armor, or, if you want to put the Bradley fighting vehicle in this category, they used the Bradley with more daring and more effectiveness than even the designers of the Bradley fighting vehicle thought it would be capable of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so there are Bradleys that are configured to carry anti-tank weapons as a means of self-defense.
Yeah.
To break contact as soon as possible in the reconnaissance role that they were designed for, but to get up there and mix it up with a platoon of Russian armor. Look, those Ukrainian operators, they are the Jimi Hendrix of the Bradley, right? Nobody can use it like that. But it's also shown me something. Look, if you're up against 4 Russian tanks and 1 Bradley, they should win.
Mm,
But they consistently fail. And now I'm back to Vodniks being sent to the front,
yeah.
right? So we're not talking German tank aces or the guys in Fury, right? Plus, they're also in vehicles that have a fundamental design flaw. And that is you start out on a tank mission and you end up in the Air Force.
And that's because you're sitting on your ammunition, right?
Exactly. You're sitting on your ammunition. All of that to save materials and to put one less person in the tank, which
Yeah.
was a blunder.
Well, when you look at statistics every day that Ragnar Gudmundsson publishes, you will see fewer and fewer tank losses and fewer armored fighting vehicle losses on the Russian side in favor of more unarmored vehicles being destroyed by the Ukrainians. It's simply because the Russians don't have the supply of tanks and armored fighting vehicles that they had 12 months ago, for example. The Ukrainians have succeeded that well in destroying them. Artillery. Russia has always had a tremendous advantage in artillery. At the beginning of the war, able to outfire Ukraine 20-1 or more. And they have maintained that ability to outfire Ukraine throughout the war. But that gap is being closed almost every single day, again, thanks to Ukrainian precision counter battery fire, but thanks to Ukrainian drone warfare. The Russians are losing thousands of artillery pieces.
They really are. And there has always been a Russian consideration. Well, artillery is the king or queen of battle, and since the Napoleonic Wars. And the Russians have always put great stock, and rightly so, in the tactical benefits of artillery dominance. There's something that most of our viewers will have seen in this war, and it's a drone photo, and there'll be an agricultural field with maybe 100 holes punched into it. You look at that, and so that is essentially the artillery equivalent of spray and pray. And the Russians put a lot of store in rocket artillery, the former Katyusha or rockets, now the Huracan system, etc., where they squirt out 20 or 30 rockets, and they are an area weapon, right? They turn a farm field of 10 acres into Swiss cheese. So that would go into volume of fire, right? How many shells do you put into the air headed at your enemy? The Russians will always dominate that, probably for the rest of this war. But what Ukraine excels in is, just as Alan was saying, counter battery fire. The Ukrainians and the Russians both, you have counter battery radar. So a shell comes in, and within milliseconds, the radar knows what kind of shell it is, how far it's going to fly, where it was fired from, and where it's going to land. And you have other artillery pieces on standby. Now your communications come in. You click the firing solution to that gun that's on standby, and it puts a shell in the air that's going to hit the bad guy artillery tube. The Russians have this capability, but they have fewer counter battery radars, and they lose them, about 2 or 3 of them a month. And they are essentially irreplaceable for the Russians. So again, so you've got the Russians shooting a machine gun at the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have a pistol, but they shoot one round back and they kill the machine gunner.
Yeah.
And they are accelerating, those losses. And as we said the other day, the Russian daily artillery losses were 8 full battalions of artillery.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen because they were shooting all around the area and they got the gun. Bang.
Yeah.
And counter battery fire now also includes a first person drone. that goes to that location revealed by counter battery radar.
You know, the other thing that Russia does with its artillery, that these are artillery emplacements. Once they find a spot that they like for their artillery, they very rarely move out of that spot. Well, I guess this is one reason why Kharkiv and Sumy and Kherson are all under artillery fire every single day, but pretty much from fixed Russian artillery emplacements. This makes it eventually easier for Ukraine to find them and destroy them. Whereas Ukraine uses artillery much differently. They shoot and they scoop.
Yeah, and if you want to survive, if you want to have a career in the artillery, instead of a 2-week deployment ending with you coming home and your mom getting the flag, you got to shoot and scoot. That's why you see self-propelled guns, right? That's why the Caesar platform, the Archer platform, various the Polish Crab system. These are vehicles. Some of them look like tanks, but they are self-propelled guns, and they are computerized. So I'm driving to my fire mission. I drive to the GPS location my vehicle tells me. I push a button. The gun is already got, but in the Navy we call the dope, the firing solution, and bang, 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 you let go of 4 rounds and you're off to your next spot. Towed artillery, you can sort of do the same thing, but you've got to wheel up with the gun, unlimber it, set it up, fire, then you got to limber the gun back up and drive off. The Russians we see are, as Alan says, in fixed positions. You dig a hole, you put a camouflage net over it, and the Russians, I see this, they constantly disappoint in basic soldiering skills, right? If you have a hatchet, you can camouflage your gun. You go out and you chop down a bunch of bushes and you arrange them like flowers and you make sure you can't find your position. The more you do that, the more likely you are to live. And just watch the targeting videos. They make no attempt to hide the gun. There's always a crossroads nearby. Why? Because they don't know how to use the land navigation. They can get to the intersection. You don't want to be offset from an intersection. Don't do it, right? Anyway, those lacks of the fundamental skills of an artillery gunner, battery commander, right up the chain of command. That's why they lose thousands of artillery pieces.
Yeah. And
good. I want them to continue.
Of course, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And here's a mistake that Ukraine is not making. Rather, it's a very smart investment. What is the homegrown artillery piece of choice? It's self-propelled artillery that they are now building 10 a month domestically. So Ukraine knows how to invest its money in any field of military manufacture. Well, infantry. We all know who has the infantry advantage. It's Russia, and it's because they can bring North Korean troops continuously to replace frontline Russian troops. They can pull 160,000 new recruits off the streets, not from St. Petersburg or Moscow or Ekaterinburg, but from elsewhere in the country. Russia, I guess, does have a kind of limitless supply of infantry that it can send to the front line.
Well, but more and more in a 21st century battle, training is required for those guys. And let's go back to the root of infantry. Where did that come from? Les enfants, the children, right? And Rome took over the world because they didn't fight like the Gauls and the Celts, like bang your spear and go, come on and get me. They fought in phalanxes. They were trained. And the Spartans were famous for training their soldiers literally from childhood. So, there is the training gap. It takes 18 months at least just to train an American grunt. That's it, 18 months so you can be a rifleman in a rifle squad in a rifle company. Guys are getting knocked on the head in the subway, in the metro at Moscow, and 2 weeks later, they're in combat in Ukraine. And they are dying in their literal battalions every day. They've hit what, 2,200 casualties in a day?
Oh, yes.
There's about 1,000 rifles in a infantry battalion. They lose a battalion every day. So there's not only problems with the training deficit of sending civilians and convicts to the front, there's also a problem with the leadership. And we have not just anecdotal information, but quantifiable information. Russian POWs being debriefed by intelligence forces, social media posts. Our instructors our commanders are drunk. They steal our paychecks. We haven't been paid in 6 months. We don't get medical attention. Everyone knew this assault would fail. You have Russian units surrendering. Entire platoons have surrendered at once. Those soldiers know that signing an agreement to go to the special military operation, they know it's a death sentence. They know they're not getting out. And when you have battle data like we had from the pre-truce ceasefire fighting, where battalions worth of gear and material casualties were suffered, but only 1,200 men, that means people were unassing their vehicles and running away. They were abandoning their guns. They were jumping out of their vehicles. We've seen hundreds of examples. They drive their tanks into ditches. They drive them off. They drive them off bridges. They back them into buildings where they can't get out. They don't want to fight anymore, Al.
Yeah. I'm sure we're going to see more of that. I do want to just mention, before I forget, and I should have mentioned it when we were talking about artillery, North Korea is supplying about half of all the artillery shells that Russia will use in a year now. And that's significant. So in addition to supplying North Korean artillery and North Korean soldiers, that's 6 million artillery shells being sent to Russia's assistance in this war, which, again, the world hasn't responded to in any appropriate way. Russia has internationalized this war. If you don't think this is a world war already, just look at who's fighting on Russia's behalf.
Right. There's another takeaway from this, and that is Russia is unable to meet its entire artillery commitments in Ukraine. They have to go to North Korea. About somewhere between 20 and 30% of the ballistic missiles are also North Korean. And by the way, folks, they malfunction at astounding rates. I mean, when I was in counterproliferation, my big joke used to be the good news about North Korean ICBMs is they're made in North Korea. So, and you're right. And we can touch on information warfare as well. Russia is blabbing to the world that it's fighting all of NATO, et cetera, when in fact we're fighting the axis of evil, and they are literally combatants in this.
Yeah.
Unremarked, there are Iranian technicians in combat. They run the Shaheed programs.
Mm-hmm.
North Koreans have been in Ukraine since 2 Novembers ago. This is an internationalized conflict, and as much as I don't like the term axis of evil, it is precisely those are the players in Ukraine right now,
Yeah.
fighting with the Russians.
They are, and we are going to talk a little bit about the evil that Russia is aiming against Ukrainian civilians, which had drones and with cluster munitions. We cannot forget to talk uh, about that terror tactic that Russia is using in Kharkiv and Kherson and Sumy and other Ukrainian cities. uh, we took a quick look at Intel, but if we go to Intel, I'd have to say Ukraine has the advantage here, not necessarily with satellite imagery, although if it continues to get satellite imagery from NATO, if Europe and Japan find ways to replace that satellite imagery, if the United States withholds it, then I think they'll be just as well off as they have always been. But their real advantage, it seems to me, is local intelligence on the ground, eyes and ears. And this can be anywhere along the zero line. It can also be well behind Russian lines in Ukraine, and it can be on the ground in Russia itself.
Right. The Ukrainians have a very well developed intelligence network. And just as Alan said, tactical battlefield intelligence right down to the company level, which means basically I got a 10-kilometer block and my own organic intelligence assets, just the stuff I have as a company commander, can give me a pretty good idea of what the Russians are doing in my area. That's, I would call that tactical battlefield intelligence. We see by the selection of targets that Ukraine uses its preciously few precision strike munitions, they hit targets of great consequence, right? If the Russians have a glide bomb that, an apartment building in Kramatorsk is a perfect target. If the Ukrainians have a guided bomb, a French hammer, for example, they're going to hit a headquarters building with it. We see that again and again. There is no equivalency in their targeting. The North Korean listening guests will remember their welcome to the Kursk battlefield, where two of their generals were wounded and much of their military staff were killed in a direct hit on their headquarters in Kursk Oblast. Those targets, look, that's an intelligence triumph to identify a lucrative target like that. And again, so Ukraine has got a precision strike munition. Look, they're not hitting an apartment building with it, right? They're they're picking off command nodes. So there is a dependence, though, that Ukraine has, especially when it comes to orbital platforms, right? Those are in high demand. The U.S. is the absolute king of space-based reconnaissance. Hopefully, we'll never see another disgraceful event as we saw earlier with the intelligence pause, which only benefited Russia, only killed Ukrainians. And let's get Marco Rubio on the show so he can tell us how that advanced the peace process. Marco,
Yeah.
tell us how it, you know, and I love this comment. We're not going to spend weeks trying to solve this war. No, Marco, I don't even think you're up to the task. And heaven forbid you should take a couple of weeks to work on this.
Yeah.
So get back to whatever you were doing, okay? And just get out of my office.
We'll talk a little bit about that too.
Sorry,
No,
Alan. I'm
I
ruining
happen
the program.
never. I happen to agree with you. I'd love to get Rubio on this show. Uh, I'm pretty sure I'd have to use my mute button on him.
Yeah.
Uh, lo- Logistics. Logistics is a category that makes such a difference, and rarely is it examined. Actually, you and I are going to sit down with General Mick Ryan in May, specifically to talk about logistics and a whole lot of other things. But Mick Ryan, who was trained as an engineer, as I recall, in the Australian Armed Forces, he is a logistical genius. And I really want his take on what the Russians have been doing uh, along any ground line of communication, almost anywhere. Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Kreminna, anywhere you look, Chasivyar, they are lining kilometers. I would have. It's the end of the supply line. Kilometers and kilometers of road with nets, both overhead and along the side. So it's as if you're at a driving range, or
Yeah,
you're
driving.
in a batting cage or something like that. And they've had to do this to preserve the integrity of their logistical supply, to protect um, their horses, and as well as their trucks from Ukrainian drones. I I don't know if it works though, Chuck.
No, and to our Russian listening guests, it doesn't work. And as you will find out, now you are constrained. Now the artillery knows exactly where you are. You can't go anywhere else. You're right there. And it might limit FPV drone operations, but believe me, the Ukrainians know how to make a shape charge, as do I. The net is not going to save you from an explosive, a shape charge with an explosively formed penetrator. Okay, good luck on buying all those fishing nets. Here's the other thing: it's not going to slow down improved conventional munitions, meaning cluster bombs, dropped from above. And we have all seen that, the artillery shell disperses them in a linear pattern, a circular pattern. You just set the fuse. So here's the road, here comes the artillery round. It's not going to do them any good. That being said, we've seen the we watched, Alan, you and I, back in the bullet points days. We watched Russia eviscerate their logistical core. You're not a truck driver. You're not a logistician. Here's your rifle. Go to Bakhmut, where, 120, 130, maybe 200,000 Russian soldiers died. Now they've got a logistical apparatus that only includes stuff coming in on trains and guys literally showing up with donkeys to unload the train.
Mhm.
That eventually, look, right now it's working for them as they are doing these attacks. I'll tell you when it's not going to work for them. When Ukraine comes out of the box, like they did in Kursk, like they did in Kherson, the entire logistical apparatus of the Russian forces will utterly and completely collapse. Utterly. They will have guys who, within 24 hours, have exhausted all of their ammunition, all of their artillery shells, all of their radio battery, every little goodie you need on the battlefield. And it's going to accelerate the collapse. Look, it already did in Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians were gaining sometimes 60 kilometers in a day. Napoleon never gained 60 kilometers in a day. Anyway,
Oh, he was on horseback.
he was on horseback, exactly. The cavalry gained 60 kilometers in a day.
Yeah, but this logistical problem did make things worse for Russia in Pokrovsk. And I think this is part of the reason why Ukraine has had success around Pokrovsk. The other thing that struck me, Chuck, when Ukraine had some lodgements on the left bank of the Dnipro, opposite Kherson City, they were supplying those raiding forces that Ukraine had gotten across the river with drones. So I assume at some point in this war, the logistical nightmare that drones have created for Russia could be potentially solved by drones becoming the chief delivery mechanism along the front line. And is that part of the future?
You are right on. The drones are becoming increasingly heavy lift. So they're basically at the point now where they could recover a human casualty. So you could attach a litter to the drone and it can fly with it. So that's a good idea of about how much, and those heavy lift drones right now, heavy lift, and we're talking 250 pounds, you know, they are, I won't say few and far between, but there are less of them. But they are manufacturing more of them. And it is quite possible in a war, say in 2050, that the vast majority of battlefield supplies will move by, you know, remotely piloted aerial vehicles up to and including very, very heavy lift platforms, right? So there's no reason why a CH-52 20 years from now, 53 rather, couldn't operate autonomously. It certainly could.
Yeah.
So that's definitely going to be happening. And even in this war, as you said, we've seen it happen.
Yeah.
It's not quite there for Kazovac yet, but look, 100 pounds of ammunition, I don't know. You can definitely turn a contact, right? You could be losing it and then you could be winning it. You think, you know, two guys enter the battle space, they're both carrying 400 rounds of ammunition. One guy runs out, the other guy's down to 20 rounds. Whoever gets the next 400 rounds is going to win the fight.
Yeah. If again, in the category of logistics, who has the advantage or the superiority? I guess I'd have to say Ukraine does, all based on their interior lines.
Absolutely. And that's every little thing in the military, you know, the slope of a 3-degree hill, which way the wind's blowing, where the sun is, whether you have interior lines, whether your logistics are dispersed and efficiently converge when they're needed, whether you've got a donkey delivering yours or a deuce and a half truck, all those things matter, right? Fuel mileage, and that, you know, the military science is collecting these small inflection points and using them to your advantage. And, you know, training, of course, seeing the necessity of a multi-month training curriculum for your soldiers, not including their military operational specialty, right? Tank driver. Look, yeah, look, I've been in a lot of wars. You drop me in a tank, I can't drive it. I don't know how to start it. You know, I'm a hog looking at a wristwatch, right? So all of those things that count, and Ukraine is doing everything right. Her allies aren't, but Ukraine is doing everything right.
Yeah. Well, let's hope when drones are making deliveries on the front line, the American military doesn't privatize the operation and have Amazon do it. That would be a huge mistake. Just before going to maps in Pokrovsk and Kreminna, we should take a look at the so-called 30-day ceasefire and Putin's so-called Easter truce. Putin's Easter truce was nothing more than a public relations ploy to try to play Trump to his favor. The moment Putin declared the Easter truce, he broke it. And while casualties actually did decline during the Easter truce, they declined beneath 1,000 a day for Russia. Combat engagements didn't really decline. Russia conducted an ambush of a Ukrainian unit up around Toretsk, as I recall. And what Putin did during the ceasefire and during his Easter truce was increase the intensity of attacks on Ukrainian cities and civilians. And he did it in a particularly terrifying way, loading Shahed drones with shrapnel, with cluster munitions, so that when these drones struck, they would cause as much death and casualties as possible. More casualties, more wounds than deaths, but That is a war crime to fill a drone with shrapnel and aim it at the center of a city.
Absolutely right. I mean, cluster munitions were actually designed to inflict damage on vehicles, right? So there are all different kinds of cluster munitions. Most of them, the U.S. kind, they fall towards the ground and they have something to retard their flight. Generally, it's like a ribbon. So it orients the weapon up and down, but the weapon has a shape charge. The most sophisticated ones come in, broadcast a radar signal, get the range above a vehicle, and then fire their shape charge, which projects a bit of molten metal down and hits a tank. They're also dual purpose because where it blows up, they create shrapnel. Okay, it's important to remember that Russia is not using these cluster munitions against Ukrainian armored formations, Ukrainian vehicles, or even Ukrainian troops in the open. They have and continue and have historically used these munitions against civilians. The Kramatorsk massacre at the train station, where they literally waited until the incoming train full of refugees was surrounded by a train of refugees hoping to join it. Just as Alan said, over the ceasefire, Russia has armed Shaheeds with cluster munitions. Again, these are designed in a city to hurt civilians. There's been another significant escalation that the Shaheed drones themselves are being coated with toxic chemicals so that the explosive ordnance technicians who are dealing with a downed Shaheed are literally poisoned by materials placed on the drone by Russia. But wait, it gets better. They're now also containing cans of asphyxiant chemical warfare agents. So it's not an explosive warhead. It is technically a riot gas, still absolutely prohibited by the chemical weapons conventions, but they're using only the Russians could come up with an anti-riot agent that is also a blistering agent, so it burns your mucous membranes, and eventually stuff is so severe it's classified as an asphyxiant. So I am literally saying during their truce, they escalated their chemical warfare campaigns to include drones with 1,000-kilometer ranges.
Yeah.
That was during your ceasefire, Marco Rubio. So please get back to us. We'd love to talk to you on the show.
Maybe we'll touch on those negotiations as we close out the show. But we do want to get to maps. I've delayed getting to maps in Kreminna and Pokrovsk so that Chuck and I were able to do something of a reset of where we stand in the course of the war right now. Now, by the way, these Russian attacks on civilians in the cities, especially Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kherson, they are practically around the clock now. They are not concentrated at night. There are broad daylight attacks on ambulances, civilian vehicles, on individual civilians simply walking to or from the supermarket. But to move on to the maps, we can go to Kreminna and then to Pokrovsk, I think.
Absolutely.
And it's in Kreminna from 15 April, if you have that map, folks. And again, the Russian target is Liman on this map.
Yeah, and so I am looking at I'm actually looking at an updated map that I have yet published, but it corresponds pretty closely to the 15 April map. A worrying development. We were looking at the Russian salient that is north of the Zarabets reservoir. There's an area sticking out there that the Russians have managed to expand what is worrying to me on the most recent contact reports, and I'll have this map up later this afternoon, folks, but there are a number of Russian contacts that are about 1 kilometer in advance of where the zero line is plotted. Okay, this doesn't mean the Russians are seizing this territory. It doesn't mean these points of contact mark successful Russian assaults, but it tells me that they are pushing west. Okay, but bear in mind, I look at this thing, and I want you to have the long view that I do. Every Russian attack loses between 30 and 80% of the assault force. That's the math. Sometimes they lose 100%. Very rarely do they lose less than 30%. But what this tells me is, of course, they are pushing hard here in Kreminna. Alan, and I know this is one of the scrappiest places for Ukrainian defenders. They're outnumbered in this area about 10 to 1. They are giving much better than they're getting. So Kreminna has always been a sort of place where the Russians didn't really do much. So they've done some stuff in the last 6 months, but what they're doing is Kreminna wasn't in the top 4 or 5 places where Russians died. That was Kupiansk, that was especially Bakhmut, it was Vuhledar. Bakhmut battle space, conservatively 250,000 Russian casualties, and that number may be double. But I think Kreminna now, Alan, is entering the zone where they're heading up to 6-digit casualties. And it may be at this point, I'd estimate 150, 175,000 Russian casualties in Kreminna. And again, a la Chasiv Yar, they have not reached Liman.
No,
They are not close to getting it either.
and they don't seem to be. And I think it's also in a battle area like Kreminna, where Ukrainian drone defense is going to come to the fore. Ukrainians are relying more and more on drones as the backbone of their defense of places. In fact, I saw a comment earlier this week or late last week that often it is the skill of the Ukrainian drone operators that determine whether or not Ukraine is successful in defense of a certain place on the zero line. That might be what we're looking at in Kreminna.
Yeah, you've got also the Russians are flailing around a bit in their tactics now. It's not yet a typical Russian attack, but they're getting to the point where they've got 100 guys on motorcycles and they send them forward.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to get to a tree line patch of, and everything you and I have been saying a long time. Everyone who's listened to us, look at the green spaces on the map, whether it's just a little green line or a patch of woods, that's where they want to get. And then the Russians plan to back them up with APCs and armor. To our Russian listening guests, you know exactly how well this is working. It is a very casualty-intense operation for you. And I would recommend, if you'd like it to succeed, try to get there before 11:30 in the morning. But again, Alan, they can't do that because their planning is bad. Their leadership is bad. The individual soldiers are trained badly. These are desperate tactics. I'm not saying they might not eventually work, but as executed, they're not working. And when we see this afternoon's map, and I'll plot those contact points, and I want everybody to look, you see that contact point, and it's 1.5 kilometers beyond the zero line. Some Russian soldier died trying to transit that open space.
Yeah.
And chances are 85% he was killed by a first-person drone.
Yeah, that's right. Look for that updated Kreminna map overnight, updated from 15 April. But we want to move on to the Pokrovsk map because this is exactly where 150 motorcycles attempted an assault, apparently towards Kotlini or Kuturi. It's alternately named on maps, and this is up on the north west bulge of the map in Pokrovsk. And I guess there's a reason why you put soldiers on motorcycles. I suppose they don't set off anti-tank mines. I suppose they can go through narrow gaps and dragon's teeth deployments and that kind of thing. But, if your 150 motorcyclists don't reach their forward position and then call up the armor, what have they accomplished? And motorcycles are noisy. You can't assemble them out of sight.
Yeah, they may have taken or thought they were taking a page out of the Army Ranger handbook. Part of the way the Rangers can seize an airfield is they parachute guys in. Parachute guys do what they can to secure landing for a C-130 that'll land, lower its ramp as it's still moving down the runway, and dozens of Rangers on dirt bikes come out of the back with night vision goggles on. And that's how they get to all positions of an airport and take it down. To our Russian listening guests, you may have noticed I said night vision goggles because this is conducted in total darkness, which makes it work, right? Because otherwise you're a clown on a motorcycle. And your motorcycle cross country will probably go 40 miles an hour because you're not a motocross rider. And I'm sure you know the speed of a first-person drone is about 60. I think we can all do the math. So these tactics the Russians are trying, they are innovative. You always want to surprise your enemy, but they're not necessarily working. Because I look closely at what the motorcycle riders are wearing. They've got an AK. They don't even have vests on.
Yeah.
They don't have sufficient ammunition to fight when they get there. And I don't think it's because the guy didn't say, hey, look, I'm riding a motorcycle. Why don't you give me 700 rounds? I don't have to carry it. Give it to me. Ergo, I think there aren't 700 rounds to give this guy. And Alan and I have talked about how much ammunition someone could go through during a heavy day of combat, and it could easily be a couple of thousand rounds. Easily. So they get there, they arrive at the tree line, their backup does not arrive, and they are stuck there and have diminishing ammunition, and eventually will have to fall back, die in place, or surrender. And coincidentally, that's what we always talked about that happens to the Russians in Kreminna. Insufficient force to reach the objective, and what fraction of the attacking force does reach the objective dies in place.
Right. They have no way out. Apparently in Pokrovsk, there was miscommunication. The Russians believed that this advanced force on motorcycles had reached the positions that they were targeting, and then advanced with armored vehicles. Ukraine took out 20 of them, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing is these battles open at 10:30 in the morning, 11:30. The Ukrainians have been watching the Russian vehicles approach, trailing dust trails for 10 kilometers. You can wake up the artillerists, tell them it's okay, finish your breakfast. We've got a couple of fire missions coming up for you. Again, that with leadership like that, tactics like that, ineptitude like that, the inability to adapt, change what you're doing, train up to the mission, the Russians are never going to win this war.
Yeah.
I still think the war could go on for 4 or 5 more years, believe me, but they're never going to get to the Dnipro. It isn't going to happen.
No. The videos of this particular attack in Pokrovsk have been pretty widely posted, and exactly as Chuck says, especially the dust trails, etc. And what Russia was trying to do was retake positions it had lost west of Pokrovsk on relatively high ground. Uh, Ukraine had forced the Russians out sometime last week, as I recall. So, roughly 5 to 7 days ago. And Ukraine has really been successful in pushing Russia back. I keep saying, and every time I say it, it just gives me another chance to be wrong. I still expect the Russians to retreat wholesale south of Pokrovsk. Haven't seen it yet, and I guess we won't.
Well, there's another constraint here that happens, and that Ukraine cannot depend on adequate quantities of material to back up offensive operations. Every day, tactical opportunities go unrealized by the Ukrainians. For example, the defeat of this 100 motorcycle kludge, this circus attack on Kuturi, there is always an opportunity when you beat off an enemy assault that you shove it down their throat and follow them back home. That's always an opportunity. Why doesn't Ukraine do this? They can't count on being able to reinforce that fast-moving operation. And the Russians also hand opportunities to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have to burn fuel. They don't have to transport troops. All they have to do every day is wait for the Russians to show up at 11:30, and they do. Right? So there's another reason why the Russians are going to lose. And there's an endemic, baked-in problem with a command structure that cannot report above and say, look, what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah.
We are getting smoked every day. This isn't working. We have to retrain, retool, and do something else. That doesn't happen in the Russian military. Your career will not blossom if you say that stuff at a briefing.
Well, they're certainly not going to be saying it now. Putin desperately wanted to make significant gains before peace negotiations or ceasefire negotiations or some kind of negotiations got underway. He has failed in that all along the zero line. Yes, they did force the Ukrainians out of Kursk Oblast. That was largely aided by the intelligence blackout imposed by Donald Trump. But nowhere else on the zero line has Russia succeeded in gaining a square kilometer here or there. Rather, they are giving up territory. And this is why Putin is now moving to the negotiating table in order to achieve there what his military has failed to deliver on the battlefield. And by God, with the help of Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio, he might just do it at the negotiating table, Chuck. I don't know.
Well, I'd certainly hope not. But Russia makes these maximalist demands. It has declared Kherson Oblast now and forever part of the Russian Federation. Well, they don't control all of Kherson Oblast. They say the same thing about Zaporizhzhia. They don't control all of Zaporizhzhia. Donetsk, ditto. Luhansk, ditto. So just exactly as Alan just said, they want things handed to them on the negotiation table that they have not won on the battlefield. And just as a footnote here, and it isn't a footnote, let's talk about the brutal treatment of those people in Ukraine in the occupied territories. You don't surrender your Ukrainian passport for a Russian passport, they're going to take your property away. You can't get a driver's license. You don't get medical care. You have no standing legally. You are literally beneath the law. You can be assaulted, beaten, raped, stabbed, murdered. You don't have any standing in the Russian occupational courts.
Yeah.
Right. There's a clear bad guy here. Somebody's on the side of the angels. I hope Washington remembers that. But this is an existential war for Ukraine. It remains one, even though Russia cannot win it. I mean, we need to end the suffering, and there is one way to do that, Alan, and that is to get the occupiers out of Ukraine.
And that is to use that one thing that has yet to be tried, fully arming Ukraine for military victory, which it could achieve, frankly. They have the leadership and they have the commitment and reason to fight. They could do it if only they were equipped to do it. And that's all they've ever asked for. Just give us the tools. We will finish the job.
And I'll add one thing. The Russian army, Russian military is consuming itself, both materially and in terms of its combat potential, its combat effectiveness. This army is eating its own guts out. Its soldiers are undertrained. They are dissatisfied. They mutiny virtually every day. A unit mutinies. What I'm saying is the whole Russian apparatus is getting more and more brittle and shaky. So if there's anything that is actually good, is the Russians keep running their forces into the ground. And on that glorious day when Ukraine can operate in combined arms maneuver warfare on a major scale, they will succeed as they did in Kharkiv and as they did in Kherson. We saw what the Russians did when they were hit by concentrated blows for a force equipped for maneuver warfare. They fled en masse.
Yeah.
The paper tiger, we just need a match. That's all
all.
you need to fight a paper tiger.
That's right. That's all we need. I think we'll be back this week with some matches. And who knows, maybe with a little gasoline too.
Absolutely.
Or at least some lighter fluid. So now that we are back on air here with indications and warnings on the Information Warfare Initiative, give us a like, share, bring folks here to see some past episodes of indications and warnings. For that matter, tell us what your favorites have been, and we'll get them up in a queue so that you can watch and listen to all of them. But for today, April 22, 2025, day 1154 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. This has been another episode with Chuck Pfarrer of Indications and Warnings. Thank you all for watching. Chuck, Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. See you again, folks, and we're back.